Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to USJ Research Institute seminars on the topics of atoms for dream, holding the American umbrella in the atomic driving lane. I'm Kazuichi Uchida, President of USJI and Vice President of Waseda University. USJI is a non-profit research institute in Washington, D.C., established in April 2009 by leading Japanese universities, and now managed by 8 universities, namely Dosha, Keio, Kyoto, Kyushu, Tsukuba, University of Tokyo, Ritsumeikan, and Waseda universities, and financially supported by a business society of both United States and Japan. The mission of USJI is to promote policy-related research to nurture young researchers relating to the United States and Japan issues, and to formulate a community of researchers and policymakers. With regard to the research activities, USJI focuses on 3 main issues, such as environment and energy, security issues, and regional collaboration. USJI organizes a few research teams consist of researchers from both Japanese and US institutions, and they publish research results and hold seminars. USJI usually holds week-long seminars twice a year, in March and September, here in Washington, D.C., and occasional seminars, once or twice a month, and sometimes hold symposium in Japan. For example, last December, USJI held a symposium titled "The First Year of the Administration and Direction of the Future Diplomacy and Security Strategies." Keynote speakers were former US Ambassador to Japan, Michael Amakos, and Japanese Defense Minister, Mr. Itsumori Onodera. Also, from last year, USJI started a Japan 101 seminar series with US Asia Institute, US Japan Council, and National Bureau on Asian Research to discuss fundamental socio-economic and political issues of current Japan in order to provide useful information to people in Capitol Hill. With regard to the details of our activities, please visit our website as often as you can. This week, we followed 10 different events covering a wide range of topics. Among them, Event 10, Sino-Japan Dynamics and the Implication of the US-Japan Alliance, is co-hosted by National Bureau of Home Asian Research. Event 9, Building the Tomodachi Generation, engaging Japanese and American students in social problem solving, is also co-hosted by US-Japan Council and the Washington Center. USJI is very pleased to collaborate with these organizations. This morning's event is number 1, as I mentioned, atoms for dream. And this is quite interesting topic of the future of US-Japan relations. We are very fortunate to have a group of distinct speakers. I'm sure today's discussion will be very stimulating and will produce fruitful and productive results. Before introducing moderator Professor Egawa, who is the chair of USJI, also the executive vice president of the University of Tokyo, I would like to ask to receive your permission of videotaping these seminars and open to public through internet. Thank you for your permission. Professor Ega, please.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Professor Uchida. And my name is Masako Egawa, Executive Vice President at the University of Tokyo, overseeing public affairs, alumni relations, development, international affairs. And I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Next to me on my right, on my left, is Professor Shunya Yoshimi. He's a Vice President responsible for educational reform at a university. But today, he's going to speak as a professor in sociology, cultural studies, and media studies. He has been a very active researcher and prolific author in the area of cultural studies, contemporary Japan, and Americanization in modern Japan. And he's been a leading scholar in the field of media, cultural studies, in contemporary Japan. And next to him is Professor Jordan Sand, and he's Associate Professor of Japanese History and Culture at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He actually studied his MA at the University, MA in Architecture History at the University of Tokyo, and has a PhD in History from Columbia University. And he was also a visiting scholar at the university last year. And so today I'm going to invite Professor Yoshimi to give a presentation. And as you know, the nuclear energy has been a very controversial and important issue in modern Japan. And more recently, this has been a topic of debate in a recent election of mayor of Japan. And it is not only an important topic to understand the Japanese politics and society after World War II, but also a critical element of the US-Japan relations. Today, Professor Yoshimi is going to discuss how public perception of nuclear energy evolved in a post-war Japan, and also how the Japanese public embraced the nuclear energy as a symbol of dream and hope. So, Professor Yoshimi, thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Vice President Masako Egawa. It's a great honor for me to come here and have a good chance to talk about one of my researches. So, because of the time constraint, let me directly go straight to my talk today and title my talk. Okay, it's not. Okay, the title of my talk today is Atoms of Dream. And this title is come from very famous presidential speech by President Eisenhower in 1953 in December in United Nations, because his speech was titled Atoms of Peace. So the main point what I'm going to talk is how Japanese people in 1950s accepted this kind of Atoms of Peace policy from the United States and in local context, and how we develop our dream for economic and cultural development in the 1960s. So most of the discussion I'm going to do is already I published 2 years ago in my Japanese book, Yume no Denshiroku, it's Atoms of Dream. And in this book, I explain how this kind of atomic dream produced a kind of monster or dystopia after 20 or 30 years. So, and the subtitle of my discussion is Holding American Umbrella in the Atomic Driving Rain. It was a very famous word, which was done by, how to say, the governmental chief of GHQ and Hoitoni. He spoke that with the Japanese government people in the late 1940s. He said that we've just been basking in the warmth of atomic sunshine. So atomic sunshine was also a very famous phrase in post-war and 1950s world. And atomic sunshine includes has the image of the nuclear technology, but at the same time, sunshine is a kind of the image of the economic development and American way of life. So the American way of life and the economic development image of the popular image of the economic development was entangled or how to say combined with the nuclear technology image. But today, after the 2011, March 11, I think, compared with the atomic sunshine image, I think we are, how to say, located in the situation of the atomic driving rain. But still now, Japanese society need to hold the American umbrella under the atomic driving rain. So this is my image after 2011. So I'm going to talk about 4 points. One is 311 and Japanese long post-war. And the second is confrontation between the anti-nuclear and atoms of peace policy. And the third one is atoms of peace exposition in 1950s. And finally, cultural consumption of atomic image in Japanese popular culture or American popular culture context. So, you know, the March 11 in 2011, so this was damaged Japanese society very much because more than 20,000 people died and 400,000 people became refugees and many destroyed. And as you know, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant was melted down. So it's huge. Still today, we have damaged so much. So you can see this is Ishinomaki city and before and after. This is Okunato station and before and after the tsunami. And this is Okunato, one of the elementary schools and before and after the tsunami. So complete damage. And how to say, this is a basic knowledge because if you compare with the damage by the other earthquake in 1923, Great Kanto earthquake, most of the people died because of the burn. And in case of the 1999, the Kobe earthquake, most of the people died because of the crash. The building was crashed in Kobe. But in this case, in 2011, most of the people died because of drowned. So the reasons were different. And also, Japanese archipelago, Japanese society or Japanese country was archipelago of how to say earthquake and tsunami and such kind of things, many kinds of disasters. And if you only look back to the earthquake and tsunami in this for 100 years, we already have experienced many tsunami and many earthquakes in 1891. In 1896, in 1923, 1927, 1933, 1945, blah, 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 blah. But it is very clear that, between 1945 to 1995, in this half century, we didn't experience many serious damage or earthquake and tsunami and such kind of. Small earthquake and small, not medium earthquake we experienced, but not serious so much. So, the Japanese post-war era, we experienced few disasters. So I'm going to talk about the meaning of this kind of the post-war era, peaceful and relatively happy post-war era in relation with atomic or nuclear image. This image is a celebrating party or a dinner party that celebrate the success of the hydrogen bomb testing in Marshall Island in 1950s. So the people, American, the military people celebrate with a shortcake figured by the mushroom, atomic mushroom. But anyway, we move, we go on. So if we go back, we look back to the this 100th century early 20th century to early 21st century, I think Japanese people experienced 4 catastrophes. One is 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, and the second is 1945 or early 1940s war defeat, because many of the city was burned out, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki was suffered by the atomic bomb. And also 1995 Hanshin Awaji earthquake, and Kobe was completely distracted. And 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. And again, if we go back, this kind of the, how to say, the thinking a century of catastrophe, between 1945 and 1995, half century, we didn't experience serious catastrophe. So we can say we experienced long post-war era period, peaceful long post-war period from 1945 to 1995. Let me divide. Well, let me divide this half century from 1945 to 1995, half and half, quarter century and a quarter century. So the turning point was 1970, and many will note in 1970s, Japanese we experienced, or we took place the Osaka World Exposition, Osaka Expo, International Exposition. It was a big event. But exactly the same day when Osaka Expo started, the first Japanese commercial nuclear plant was started. And all the energy which was produced by the nuclear plant in Tsuruga was transferred to Osaka Exposition site. So all the people who attend the opening ceremony of the Osaka Exposition, International Exposition, celebrate this is new energy which is produced by nuclear plant and new electricity. So Osaka Exposition's electricity in the Osaka Exposition was produced in nuclear plant. And after the Osaka Expo in 1970s, many of the new nuclear plant was started to produce electricity, including Mihama in 1970, and which was designed by Westinghouse, and including the Fukushima Daiichi 1971. So it started in 1971, and it was designed and constructed by General Electric. And 1974, Takahama, 75, Genkai, and 76, Hamaoka. So most of the Japanese, many of the Japanese nuclear plant was started in the early 1970s. And many was designed and produced by American nuclear electric companies. So we need to think about what happened before 1970 and what happened after 1970s. So let me go back from 1950 to 1960s. Because from 1950 to 1970s, there is a kind of the antagonism or confrontation between the Atoms for Peace policy and the anti-nuclear movement. Because on the one hand, Japanese, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki suffered by atomic bomb. And after that, 1954, the beginning atoll incident, Lucky Dragon, Lucky Dragon incident was occurred. So, late 1950s, anti-atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb movement was expanded in Japan, on the one hand. But at the same time, in 1953, President Eisenhower speaks about Atoms for Peace speech. He did. And Yomiuri newspaper and other kind of newspaper organized Atoms for Peace exposition many places in Japan. So there's a kind of that confrontation between these two kinds of trend. And after the 1960s, but it was integrated to one direction to produce a peaceful new, nuclear energy or nuclear technology, to develop nuclear technology to produce a clean nuclear energy. So this is a basic trend. So what this kind of happen? But before that, please let me remind you that there is a kind of a collaboration or embracement between American Atoms for Peace policy and Japanese acceptance of this kind of Atoms for Peace policy from Japanese side. From American perspective, the Atoms for Peace policy or nuclear policy has a three, important points. One is it was a New York and Atoms for Peace policy, especially President Eisenhower, has a three important points. One is it was a strategy for the sustainable long Cold War, because nuclear technology or atomic bomb, atomic military the atomic bomb and other kinds of nuclear military weapon was basically cheap compared with soldiers. Soldiers is more expensive, and the nuclear technology was cheap. So, in order to keep the Cold War sustainably, nuclear technology was necessary for American military. And secondly, President Eisenhower was a Republican, and he wanted to export the nuclear industry from abroad, including Japan. So this is a strategy to export the American industry all around the world. And finally, it was a strategy to forget Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there's three different elements. And Japanese side, we already accepted, or we've accepted this kind of American strategy, especially by Shoriki Matsutaro and Nakasone Yasuhiro and those kind of elderly people. Because in 1950s, there is a very strong anti-American sentiment, including the anti-atomic bomb and anti-American military base and so on. So in order to produce, or producing or supporting and facilitating that Atoms for Peace policy include to oppress or such kind of the anti-American sentiment in Japanese grassroots people, within the Japanese people. So they changed this kind of anti-American sentiment towards the Japanese dream for American way of life. So nuclear power plants by American capital make us to realize the American way, the affluent American way of life in Japanese everyday life. This kind of business. So let me more clearly explain about what happened at Atoms for Peace exposition in many places. Because this photograph was a photograph of the Atoms for Peace exposition, which was taking place in middle of 1950s in Hibiya Park in Tokyo. So you can have long line who is waiting for entrance to the Atoms for Peace exposition. This is not it's the long line to waiting for enter to the exposition. So, so it was a very popular exposition, and this Atoms for Peace exposition was taking place, were taking place in many places: Tokyo, Nagoya, Kyoto, Osaka, Hiroshima, Fukuoka, Sapporo, Sendai, Mito, Okayama, Takaoka, many places. And all these kinds of Atoms for Peace exposition was supported or sponsored by the local but major newspapers in many places: Yomiuri, Chunichi, Asahi, and Hokkaido, Kahoku. This is almost all the major newspapers in Japan, not only Yomiuri, but also many other newspapers. And also, this was supported and sponsored by American Embassy. So this is the press, so all around Japan's world. So Atoms for Peace exposition in Japan was all major newspaper companies supported, and USIA, American Embassy supports them. But this exposition was not only taking place, or not only taking place in Japan, but also all around the world, including the UK, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, Greece, and Norway, and Yugoslavia, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, India, and Brazil, and Argentina, and everywhere. So it was the Atoms for Peace exposition was a global strategy in the 1950s. So it is, maybe you can do the very interesting comparative studies what happened in each country, how this kind of Atoms for Peace policy and exposition accepted, not only in Japan but also, for example, Turkey or Yugoslavia and Latin American countries. And the comparative study might be very interesting. But anyway, please focus on Atoms for Peace exposition in Hiroshima, because Hiroshima is exactly the place where that was suffered by atomic bomb. But American Embassy and the local newspaper was very much, keen to have an Atoms for Peace exposition in Hiroshima. And the site was also interesting because you can see that. Because have you ever been, I don't know how you have ever been visited in Hiroshima, but if you visit Hiroshima, you can say Peace Museum, Peace Memorial Museum is a museum, and Peace Memorial Park was a main tourist area and park in Hiroshima. But the Atoms for Peace exposition was exactly the same place, which is taking place, exactly the same place. You can see that. In this news, so many examples, but one of the young people, young group, who came from Nagasaki, said in newspaper, it's a quote, they said, although we feel sincere anger against atomic bombing, we understood the great usefulness for atomic energy after our visiting in Expo in Hiroshima. So this kind of word. So the politically or by policy, the Japanese government and American government try to change the image of the atomic energy from destructive military power to peaceful and useful industrial power. So they try to change. Then, horror and anger against atomic bomb change new understanding of atomic energy. As a total, I read many newspaper and articles in those days, and there's two major discourse about Atoms for Peace exposition in those days. One is a discourse of salvation. In this discourse, it is said, as Japan has suffered by destructive energy of atomic bomb, Japan may wish improvement of human life by same atomic energy. This is one type of discourse. The other type of discourse is discourse of resource scarcity, because it is said that as Japan has scarce resources after we lost all colonies, atomic energy is the only way to make us possible to recover our economy. This is the second discourse. So there is a kind of amalgam of these discourses. But after we introduce this kind of atomic energy, the direction is very clear, because after the 1960s, the construction of the nuclear plant was started. But all of the new atomic plant, including the Fukushima Daiichi, was designed and constructed by General Electric and Westinghouse. So many of the engineers from US come to Japan, and they built up the GE villages and Westinghouse villages in Japanese local area. And for Japanese local people, the GE villages or Westinghouse villages are amazing and dreaming, because they have a Christmas party and Thanksgiving Day and many kinds of wine and turkey and many party and so it's so rich, and people was fascinated. Local people was fascinated by that kind of American cultures. So American cultures and nuclear technology was emerging as a kind of very rich and affluent American, one of the symbol of American culture and the symbol of modernity. So it was introduced to Japan. So after 20 or 30 years, this map is not good design, but we have so many nuclear plants all around the island, all around this country, and at the same time, many resort processes, and still have American military base also. So finally, I'm going to talk about how the culture is consumed by this atomic bomb and the nuclear technology image within the Japanese popular culture and American popular culture. So you know him or it. Everyone knows him. All around the world, he is Godzilla. But maybe you know, Godzilla was a metaphor of the atomic bomb. Because he was born in 1954, just after the Lucky Dragon and Bikini Atoll incident. and the image of the atomic bomb and atomic technology was transformed to the image of the Godzilla. But I'm going to talk about the Godzilla image, many things, but skip. And I'm going to explain about the popular image, popular cultural image of atomic bomb in US in 1940 and 1950, early 1950s, and Japan after the 1950s was quite different. So I will explain a little bit. I will explain a little bit about the American image of the atomic bomb until the early 1950s, because there's a many, how to say, pop song and pop music titled about atomic bomb and atomic energy. There are two different types. One is atomic orientalism. So in 1945, Slim Gaylor Quartet sang Atomic Cocktail, and Buchanan Brothers in 1946, Atomic Power, and Jackie Doll, when they dropped the atomic bomb, and also in 1957, Wanda Jackson, she sang Fujiyama Mama. So there's these kind of so many these kind of atomic pop song in early 1950s, 40s, and 50s US. And in case of the Fujiyama Mama, sung by Wanda Jackson, she was also celebrated by Japanese audiences because she came to Japan, Tokyo, as a Nichigeki Western Carnival in 1949, and she sang, and the Japanese people applauded and welcome. So that's kind of the, and the Japanese cover version of this song, Fujiyama Mama, was published or produced by Japanese famous singer Yukimura Izumi. And Yukimura Izumi, producer from Toshiba or somewhere, she produced a record on Fujiyama Mama also. So it is a very famous. And also, I don't have enough time, so also I can see there's a many, B-class Hollywood movie, or blockbuster movie on monster who was burned by the effect of atomic bomb. So, for example, the Beast from 2000 Phantom in 1953 and 1954. It's an ant and lizard and octopus. So many different kinds of how the monster was produced by the effect of atomic bomb. And such kind of B-class movie was, how to say, in many ways produced early 1950s. And Godzilla. Godzilla was one of the variations from this kind of monster movie, which was, how to say, which was in many ways produced in the US and US. But Godzilla was quite different from those kind of Hollywood movies, because Godzilla was, how to say, produced from the perspective of the suffered people. So, because always in Godzilla, the first Godzilla movie, this movie showed how people were suffered by Godzilla, and how people was, and the city was destroyed by Godzilla, and we can do nothing, almost nothing. Japanese army, Japanese police, and all the Japanese society can do almost nothing. So destroyed and destroyed, destroyed. So this kind of experience, and this kind of image was a suffered image. And Godzilla was so strong. So Godzilla was some kind of symbolic metaphor of atomic bomb. And so it is quite different from the Astro Boy. Astro Boy became the popular comic, a popular anime after the 1960s. And Astro Boy was a symbol of the Atoms for Peace policy. Symbol of this, because the Astro Boy was moved because of the atomic energy. It is the same as the Doraemon and Gundam. All the Japanese robots in anime, not all, but many of the Japanese robots was moved because of the atomic energy. So Doraemon is very dangerous. Don't touch him, because Doraemon has a nuclear reactor within his body. Not only many things who who move out from the system. Also, atom is the Tetsun atom, the atomic Astro Boy is a nuclear reactor, Bodoram is a nuclear reactor, and Gundam is a nuclear reactor, those kind of things. But it's basically the atmosphere peace policy. But Godzilla is different. Godzilla is, basically produced is as a symbol of atomic bomb. And Godzilla was very popular in 1950s and 1960s. But after the late 1960s, the popularity of the Godzilla in Japan was rapidly going down. And character of Godzilla itself has changed from very fierce, a very dangerous guy, to very peaceful guy. So you can see the two different phases. The first one is early Godzilla, Godzilla in 1950s. And Godzilla looks like lizard. But this one, the below is a Godzilla in 1970s. And he looks like frog. Actually, the face of Godzilla changed from lizard-like face to frog-like face. So he became more cute. The frog is more cute than lizard, basically. So this kind of change has happened. This kind of transformation is very strongly related with the Japanese sentiment toward the nuclear technology. And I'll finish very soon. So in terms of the image, the symbolic or metaphorical image of the nuclear technology or atomic, atomic image, atomic bomb image in Japanese subculture, there is two different directions. One is a narrative salvation, because from Godzilla, the starting point was a popular image of Godzilla in relation to the bomb. But Godzilla, in terms of the narrative salvation, the Japanese film industry produced, for example, Mothra and Nausicaa. It was produced by Miyazaki Hayao. And this is a narrative salvation. But there is another kind of salvation, narrative discourses, narrative of implosion. Because after the 1970s, 1980s, nuclear technology or nuclear, explosion was implemented within our own body. And many Yamato, Uchu Senkan Yamato and Akira, and many Japanese comic and Japanese pop subculture includes the image of the implosion, of the atomic implosion within our own body. Conclusion. So I will talk about three different things. One is the American nuclear policy and the Japanese long postwar policy, and the collaboration between two different policies. So from US in 1950s, atmosphere peace policy was started by President Eisenhower, and it was accepted by Japanese people as American way of life. So anti-nuclear consciousness, there is a confrontation between the anti-nuclear consciousness and atmosphere peace policy in 1950s. But after the 1970s, the nuclear power plant has increased very much. So the formation of the popular consciousness has changed during the 1960s. And second, atmosphere peace exposition. These are very interesting cases about how Japanese people accepted this kind of atmosphere peace policy. And there are two different discourses. One is a discourse of salvation, and the other is a discourse of resource scarcity. And through these kinds of two different discourses, Japanese people accepted American dream, American way of life with atomic technology. And finally, after the 1970s, the subculture consciousness, Japanese subculture is very popular in the world today, but there was a subculture implosion of atomic explosion. So from US side, from late 1940s to 1950s, there is a kind of atomic orientalism and atomic sexuality, and it's quite different of the image of the atomic bomb in Japan in 1950s. But after the late 1960s, the image of the Godzilla, very brutal and very destructive Godzilla, was disappeared and has changed. So this is the last slide. Because if we go back to think this kind of history, from longer history of Japanese society and global modernity, because it's a very too simple maybe, but you can think about Japanese modern history every quarter century. Because 25 years after 1945 was 1970s, and it was Osaka Expo, I already explained. And after 25 years after 1970 was 1995, and Ohm Shinrikyo incident and the Kobe earthquake happened. But to think about 25 years, a quarter century before the 1945 1920s, and the Great Country earthquakes occurred in 1923. And 25 years before 1920 was 1895. And it was exactly the year the Japan cinema Nishin Sensor was occurred. And 25 years before 1895, maybe this is too simple, but don't believe me. But but before the 25 years before the 1895 was 1970, and the major restoration was done in 1968. So I am too simplest, but Japanese modern history has changed every 25 years. So what happened in 25 years after 1995? Because it was 2020. And the Tokyo Olympic Game was supposed to be taking place in 2020. So I don't know, maybe after that 2020, Japanese society and the relationship between Japan and Asia and America, or many things are going to change, supposed to be changed after 2020. So maybe this this kind of history is too simple, I know. But maybe I'm happy if this kind of history can little bit stimulate your imagination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yoshimi, for a very provoking presentation. So I'd like to invite Professor Sand for his comments and remarks.
I'll comment from right here.
Sure, that's fine.
My thanks to the USJI and to Professors Egawa and Yoshimi for giving me this opportunity to comment on Professor Yoshimi's indeed very provocative presentation, characteristic tour de force from this man. I have known him for some time. I had the pleasure of being a visiting scholar and teaching for a year in the International Interdisciplinary Graduate Program at Tokyo University, which Professor Yoshimi was instrumental in starting. I was there just last year. And I read the book that Professor Yoshimi referred to today, Yume no Genshi Ryoku, Atoms for Dream. This book should be read together with Professor Yoshimi's work on the Osaka Exposition and his brilliant and equally provocative book Shinbei Hanbei, which should be translated Loving America, Hating America, maybe. And I think there's a translation in the works, or so I've heard that gossip. I certainly hope that appears soon. These books together really represent a kind of a distinct, almost a rediscovery of Japanese post-war society. And what I feel most when I read them is that all this time that we thought we knew contemporary Japan and Japanese culture, we didn't see how intimately geopolitics and American military hegemony were wrapped up in it or lay behind it, even in popular culture like jazz and anime and so forth. But it is interesting, this is a book about what he calls a dream, and I think it also is pretty clear from his opening paragraphs as well, that it's a history book. That is, it's a history of a dream that's over. And 3/11 has made it history. The public, at the time that nuclear energy, nuclear power was introduced to Japan, now appears so innocent and perhaps ignorant. The word he uses quite frequently is no tenki, too easy going. Even if Japan does restart its reactors, and some of them may be restarted soon, the public will never be quite as innocent again. And in this sense, the dream that Professor Yoshimi speaks of belongs to the past. And I think if we go back to the 50s, and this is true in this country too, that the public then appears particularly foreign to us in a number of ways, living in a different world of values and perception of the rest of the world. Nuclear radiation, as he makes clear, was perceived very differently between the US and Japan, but also in both of these countries very differently than almost any of us perceive it today. Yoshimi Sensei's book tells a story that in some ways is similar to a book I just showed him. It came out very recently from US historian Kate Brown called Plutopia. It's a very interesting work on two towns, one in Washington State and one deep in rural Russia, which were the first two towns in the world to produce plutonium. And between these two, over the course of 4 decades, they also released what she reports is the equivalent of 4 Chernobyl accidents worth of radiation into their surrounding environments. But what's interesting in this narrative, and reminds me so much of the dream that is discussed in Professor Yoshimi's book, is that at the same time they were created as utopian communities. And the people living there perceived themselves as a fortunate group and an elite of a kind, although over the years many workers in both and local farmers would develop thyroid cancer and all kinds of other diseases, and it became a very disputed dream or utopia in both cases. So even at the same time that nuclear energy was being presented in the Athens for Peace exhibits and elsewhere as the safe and clean energy, people knew that nuclear material itself was dangerous and dirty stuff. There was never, this was known from the time of the Curies. And Al Gore Sr., father of the environmental crusader, proposed ending the Korean War by spreading so much plutonium waste along the 38th parallel that the whole area would become impassable, and anybody who attempts to cross it would die of radiation sickness. This is just a reflection that they were thinking about at the time, contemplating the dirty uses of nuclear material, not just in the form of the atomic bomb. And in fact, this was seen as, when compared to Eisenhower's proposal, that it was quite conceivable we should bomb North Korean and Chinese cities with atomic bombs. This was seen as the ethical alternative, you know. Destroy a portion of the planet and make it impassable. So they were really thinking about our relationship to the environment very differently in the 1950s. This was a time before we knew that human beings were altering the world climate, but experiments were going on in this country to intentionally alter the climate, perhaps in the Soviet Union, in order to degrade their agricultural production. A recent book by Jacob Hamlin called Arming Mother Nature discusses this. Experiments with global climate were also part of this very different perception of our relationship to the rest of the world at the time. As Professor Yoshimi shows, Japan's special position as a victim of the atomic bomb, and at the same time as America's Yutosei, the sort of class pet, first #1 adopter of American technology. This dual role created a peculiar situation in Japan with the powerful rejection of the bomb, of course, coupled with, as he has demonstrated, an unusually enthusiastic embrace of nuclear energy. I think, though, and I don't speak with a lot of expertise, there may be people who can provide much more on this subject than I can, but after reading recently a wonderful dissertation to come out of our own department, I'm in the Department of History at Georgetown, I think that there's another parallel history to this dream of nuclear power, and that's a history that continues to the present. It didn't really, we haven't concluded it, and I don't know if we ever will. And I mean not the history of opposition to nuclear power, which, muted as it was, did exist. There was and has been opposition before 3/11, of course. But I mean the history of a global risk consciousness. History that there are new boundless risks that humanity faces. And the dissertation I'll put a plug for is by a brilliant young Japanese historian that is of Japanese background, Higuchi Toshihiro. He wrote a dissertation called Radioactive Fallout, the Politics of Risk and the Making of the Global Environmental Crisis. And Higuchi frames this between the Lucky Dragon incident of 1954 and the partial nuclear test ban of 1963. That's the period he focuses on. And the issue of global fallout as a new kind of risk emerges, of course, with the Lucky Dragon incident, the Bikini bomb test. This was contamination without boundaries. And Higuchi calls it a trans-scientific problem because it was a problem that couldn't be resolved and contained within the community of experts. Experts on nuclear power or experts on genetics. There was no keeping it from becoming a global public policy problem. Governments had to guarantee their citizens' security. This leads to monitoring, first in Japan. Scientists, expert panels created, of course. Then the experts produce wildly varying results. Then there's public discontent. Then there are citizens groups trying to do their own monitoring. The very same pattern we've seen recently, of course, with Fukushima. This was happening in the mid-1950s as well. It did not, as Professor Yoshimi emphasizes, it did not lead to a mass movement against nuclear energy. But it did lead to a new consciousness about us all being in this kind of dilemma, a global condition of uncertainty. Here was this intangible threat, we couldn't feel it or see it. We can't even really determine statistically whether it's a real threat or not, and yet it mobilized people. In Japan, of course, it mobilized people in Gensuikyo, the Council Against the Hydrogen Bomb, that became an enormous mass movement. And we tend to think of that in association with nuclear fear, dread of the atomic Armageddon. But it started, it's really important that it started with housewives in Suginami-ku. And also in the United States and Europe, it's very, very strongly, this movement for a nuclear test ban is very strongly influenced by women concerned about food system contamination. So it really is a consumer response. In Japan, it was contaminated tuna. Here in Europe, it was often milk. That there's this contamination that something has to be done about it. And then in Japan, ironically, it's none other than Kishi Nobusuke who calls for a nuclear test ban, apparently to steal the issue from the Japanese left. So just as nuclear energy could be untied from nuclear weapons, the validity of the atmospheric test could be decoupled from arguments for the accepting the nuclear umbrella, because Kishi clearly accepted the nuclear umbrella, but he was ready to, for I guess what were reasons of political strategy, he was ready to oppose atmospheric testing. And ultimately, this process globally does result in the 1963 partial test ban and the end of atmospheric testing. Most historians of the Cold War have treated this 1963 test ban as a failure because it didn't do anything to slow the arms race. And so in terms of nuclear weapons, it certainly was not an important landmark. But as Higuchi's dissertation shows, at the time it was also recognized as the world's first anti-pollution treaty, which is interesting because it's the first moment where a mass movement everywhere saying that this contamination affects us no matter what country we're in, or possibly affects us, we don't know, but we're afraid of it, moved policy. And this global thinking about uncontainable risks carries right into present-day global warming responses and policy making. And of course, the radiation effects of bomb fallout are the same as the effects of radiation exposure from a nuclear power plant accident. And people knew this then. I think one of the things that's remarkable about Professor Yoshimi's history is that despite their knowing this, the US and the Japanese governments and the Japanese media managed to shield the nascent Japanese nuclear power industry so effectively from public awareness of the risk. The two operated almost entirely in parallel, but still maybe latent. There was that awareness of an unresolvable and uncertain risk sort of on the horizon somewhere. And I just conclude my remarks to say there really are, there are a couple of aspects that make nuclear risk different and make the nuclear accidents and the fear of them different from other pollution cases. The first is that the science is in the science itself, that the numbers that are deployed are so variable. Scientists disagree by orders of magnitude about the probability of a nuclear plant accident, about what are considered acceptable doses, that it really proved, and it proved in the context of the public response and the scientific community's response to the fallout from the Bikini Atoll bomb, that science is not a neutral outsider to political debates. This really became evident in that period. And the second is the social character of the nuclear risk. That awareness of the risk, because it's invisible and it's so pervasive and it could last for generations. Awareness of the risk itself has to be taken into account as something as real as the threat of harm itself. And just the day before yesterday, the Japan Times actually ran a piece about stress-related deaths in Fukushima. And they reported that stress and other illnesses, I'm quoting here, related to the 2011 quake and tsunami have killed 1,656 people in Fukushima Prefecture as of Wednesday, outnumbering the 1,607 whose deaths were directly tied to disaster-caused injuries. Given that such deaths are increasing, experts say a new set of criteria may be necessary in order to take into account the effects of the nuclear plant catastrophe. That's the Japan Times just a couple of days ago. The point is that anxiety about the unknown element of this risk is as much a health problem as real radiation sickness is. It's a very special aspect of the dilemma of nukes. So the dream, as Professor Yoshimi described it, is over. I personally would like to see Japan's enormous capacity for technological innovation directed toward a new dream of genuinely sustainable forms of energy. But whatever direction the energy policy of Japan takes from here, or Japan and the rest of the world, this country, we've just learned that there are going to be new subsidies for nuclear reactor in Georgia, something like 30 times the cost invested in Solyndra. We know that the genie can't be returned to the bottle, and Yoshimi Sensei's work teaches us a great deal about how we got into this mess. We can only hope that some new sort of US-Japan relationship can start working toward getting us out of it.
Thank you very much for very comprehensive feedback or comments, Professor Sand. Since we only have half an hour left in this session, I'd like to ask Professor Yoshimi to
very
briefly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Sand, and I really appreciate your comment. And basically, I very much agree with the idea. And because from 1950s, even the middle of 1950s, there is a kind of the expansion, or it's a huge transnational movement about anti-nuclear and people's movement to care about global risk. And so there's another, this kind of another history was exist even before the 1960s. I agree. And but at the same time, I think, because I'm a sociologist and at the same time a cultural studies person, so not only in Japan but in many world, many of the researchers and sociologists and cultural people are very much already wrote many articles and many books about this kind of the people's movement and the social movement. Basically, they're very much interested in the anti-military based movement and the anti-nuclear movement and many kinds of the new social movement and so on. So, and my position is, because I know it is very important, but in some sense it is not my work. Because even if I don't do that kind of work, many more talented people can do that in the field of sociology and in the field of cultural studies, because the sociologists, environmental sociology and cultural sociology are more interested in how to say the social movement and alternative movement and grassroots movement. So these are quite important things, but I think there is also another face of coin, because at the same time, I think throughout the Japanese post-war history, there is a kind of embracement between the, how to say, the nuclear policy from US and the Japanese government policy, and there is a kind of collaboration, hegemonic collaboration about the development of not only nuclear but also military and another kind of the, how to say, US-Japan relationship, hegemonic relationship. And this is at the same time I think very important to think about. So my work is basically my basic question is why a Japanese society could accept the nuclear strategy from Eisenhower so easily from 1950s to 1960s. And my answer is it was very much comfortable for Japanese post-war people, period, because it makes us to realize the affluent American dream and affluent life. And that is exactly what we wanted. So, I say, that kind of the post-war hegemonic culture formation is also need to think about at the same time with, how say, the grassroots alternative movement. And I think this kind of the powerful hegemonic how say, formation of the culture is not so much interested by many, how say, so many people. So that is exactly what I want to make clear. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for raising the issue and making it clear your position. So I'd like to open up the discussion and invite questions from the floor.
Alrighty. Thank you very much for your presentation today. I'd just like to briefly ask about an aspect of nuclear power that we... Aaron Webb, recently, George Mason University. America has a functioning dialogue around nuclear power production, at least. The plants still run, we're building new plants, but we have failed for 50 years now to address the question of nuclear waste. We don't put it anywhere. We leave it in very safe places right around nuclear power plants, and there is no policy, scientific, or cultural progress on solving that problem. How does that compare to Japan, and have they made efforts towards storing nuclear waste that perhaps we in the United States could learn from and help move forward in our process here?
I think it's the same, because also in Japan there is no answer and no solution about the nuclear waste. So in Aomori, and we have the plant for this nuclear waste, but that is not clear answer about that at all. And after the Fukushima Daiichi, the nuclear plant incident, there's no answer, no solution. So every day in Fukushima, you know that the many big tank with polluted water was located in so many tanks, and the number of the tank is still increasing even today. So, Professor Sando, do you have some?
I'm not aware of Japan having come up with any solutions very different from the United States. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that because the United States has much more sparsely populated locations where they can put nuclear plants, the issue of location, when the first plants were planned for Japan, presented very different problems. And some people, I read somebody in the scientific community in Japan in the 50s saying, you know, actually the United States is pushing this because they want to see how nuclear plant siting in a very densely populated place plays out. Now, I don't know if that was actually the thinking of the American side. There were lots of other reasons that Professor Yoshimi describes for the United States nuclear industry to move into the Japanese market. But it presented very different problems, and I don't think that there are practical solutions for the waste that are needed, but I'm not an expert.
Thank you very much for your responses. Anybody else? Please.
I think I could speak from here without using the microphone. Can you hear me? Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Donald Roenberger from Department of Defense, but I'm not here in that capacity. But I would like to mention that with regard to the previous person here, the idea that we don't have a policy or that we haven't looked at it, I think we do have a policy, and I think it has been raised by states and different communities in the United States under the form of don't put it in my backyard, don't even transfer it from one place to another, through my state, through my county, etc. So there is a policy, but it's a policy that's contrary to current activity on the part of the various nuclear plants and the commissions as well. In Japan, I noticed that that's not been, and ever since the planning of the Rokasho nuclear reprocessing plant, that the thought of reprocessing as opposed to eliminating it from the face of the earth, which was to continue to use it on a cycle where it would just be used over and over and over again. Prior to Rokasho, there was still reprocessing going on by taking it to France. People, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the big flotilla that went from Japan to France with nuclear waste to be reprocessed in France. So I think the process in Japan was reprocessing. The process in the United States is putting it somewhere where it's never going to be touched again and it's not going to bother us. And so I think that there is a chance for maybe that kind of rethinking, especially since a lot of the plants in Japan are actually American design. The Fukushima plants are General Electric. It's something that I think there is being concern raised. So I'm going to say more. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. To you. Did anybody raise their hand? Okay, please.
Thank you very much today. My name is Naoko Funatsu from East West Center in Washington, and thank you very much that I really understand that how the discourse toward the nuclear have been made both in the United States and Japan. And for America, the number one is sustainable Cold War, the number two is export to related industry, and number three is mediating sentiment for Nagasaki or Hiroshima. And for Japan, accepting the outline life, which basically means economic development. And it seems to me that Japan is still sticking to that strategy or the discourse toward nuclear.
Yeah.
But I'd like to know about the current strategy or the discourse toward nuclear of the United States, because the Cold War is over right now. So what is the strategy is used in the United States right now? Is that something
yes.
you are
But
prepared
I completely agree. Thank you very much for really say perfect understanding about my talk, and I agree with you. And but in terms of the U.S. policy, I'm not specialist. So.
Anybody in the audience
Maybe
somebody in the audience would like to address this question about the U.S. nuclear policy?
Maybe different because it is
Mr. Rubber, you may have more information for us to pick it up.
But your summarize is
Right.
very right, perfect.
Would you like to address that question?
I'm not answering for the United States government or the Department of Defense, but recent Japanese press, as well as the Financial Times weekend edition, in fact, just this past weekend, addressed that in a very open way. And the policy is obviously one of concern. And what is driving people's concerns is the emergence of China as a global naval power. And so if you look back at that article, which was just a couple of days, you'll see where the United States and Japan are looking and probably planning and posturing with regard to that ongoing policy, and probably a policy of containment, or at least a policy of keeping things from getting really wildly out of control. So.
Thank you very much for your comment. And the relationship, the issue of China will be more discussed later this week, especially on Thursday. There's a session. So anybody else has a comments on this? In the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I was Washington Research and Analysis, and I've been holding the story inside me for a long time, and now seems to be the chance to share it with other than my wife. That's what being so short. I'm shrinking. And Professor Sand mentioned about the nuclear aerial test ban treaty back in the, was that late 50s or early 60s? 63. And I studied nuclear engineering back in nuclear physics back in 1961. And the professor told us at that time, and this was in Cleveland at the Case Institute, that the hydrogen bomb testings were so contaminated, so devastating to the environment that, especially the Bikini South Pacific ones, which blew up atolls, mostly of calcium, made of calcium, because these were essentially seashells that were blown up. And so if you go up any moment in the air to the roof of the school building and collect 1 cubic meter of air, you will find at least one strontium particle, which if you inhale and lodges in you, it could cause lung cancer. And that is the reason why both United States and Soviet Union, which was testing Tsar Bomba, which was something like 50 to 50 megaton worth of, and almost splitting the Earth's crust kind of bombs. That's why in the midst of Cold War, both Soviet Union and US agreed not to continue with the aerial bombing because of the total global contamination of the atmosphere with these calcium-based strontium-90 particles. Of course, those things have very long half-life, so I imagine I don't know what happened to them. Since that time, people don't talk about them.
You're breathing them now.
But I think part of the cigarette-based cancer is those particles. Thank you.
May I say something?
Thank you. Yes, Professor Zhang.
Thank you for that comment. This was what I was trying to allude to, and I'm afraid that I didn't put it very well. I was not trying to make a case for the power of social movements, although there were certainly, that's a case that can be made. But in another sense, it's this consciousness that was new, that anywhere you could go up onto the roof, and it could be Brazil or Sweden or wherever, and that you might find these strontium particles from Bikini. And that governments, this government in this country and in Japan, left or right, govern in this era for consumers. They govern a mass citizen public that has to be assured that what they are daily living with and consuming and giving to their kids is safe. And that presented this dilemma. It wasn't necessarily the triumph of the Gensui-kyo. It was this emerging discovery all over the world that made it such a PR nightmare for the United States and the Soviet Union to keep atmospheric testing that it seems to have led to this partial and ultimately, in terms of the arms race, ineffectual ban.
Okay, thank you. Please.
I'm Charlie Baer with the Stimson Center. You mentioned the idea of Atoms for Peace being directed at trying to forget Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but from whose perspective do you think that that was aimed more for a U.S. domestic audience or for the global audience in general, or do you think that that was articulated in some way that was specific to the Japanese audience and trying to get them to forget the idea?
Yeah, specific to the Japanese audience because how to say, from U.S. policy or even the Japanese policy or Japanese government, if you can build a nuclear plant or if you can organize atoms for explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so Japanese government, some of the Japanese government or even the American perspective, they thought that some of the Japanese audiences and Japanese people can change the idea of atomic technology because the Japanese people are so much, they thought, so much obsessed by the suffering of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if Japanese people can understand, they thought, the possibility of the nuclear technology, the suffering feeling of Hiroshima and Nagasaki decreased within Japanese people. So the target is the Japanese people themselves, ourselves. And the American policy and the Japanese government policy want to change our mind. Specifically, to focus on the Japanese people ourselves. This is my answer. Is it right to your question?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting take.
Yeah. And can I add one thing? And what I want to say, and because I've been talked about Fukushima and Tsuruga and some of the nuclear plant areas, and one of the important things, for example, especially Fukushima case, is Fukushima area was a coal town, coal mine town, before they became the nuclear power plant area. Because Joban Tanko, is a Joban coal mine, was one of the major coal mine in Japan. And at the middle of 1950s, the Japanese energy policy has changed because Japan's energy policy needs to change from coal to oil. And because, how to say, the oil industry, including so many, because you have many American oil industry, and oil company has a very strong power in the 1950s. And Japanese governmental policy was influenced by this kind of global power. And it has changed from coal to oil. And so coal mine lost the, how to say, the market. And so after the 1960s and 1970s, the coal mine, coal town gone down. And so in order to survive, those areas need to choose. On the one hand, one possibility is that they change from coal town to nuclear town. And the other possibility is they choose, in case of Fukushima, they chose from coal mine to Hawaii. Because they built a Joban Hawaiian Center. Because Japanese people, Postwar Japanese people, Hawaii has a dreaming image of paradise. And we want to import the image of Hawaii in many places in Japan. And Japanese people enjoy to stay in that kind of resort place. So I've been visited in Joban Hawaiian Center, and I was amazed and surprised because, or amazed in Joban Hawaiian Center, whole around has a big whole area like this, and you can see the American advertising plate whole around the world, and all the American advertising plate show the advertisement in 1950s. So the people want to be, Japanese people in 1960s and 1970s want to be American people. Sometimes American people in 1950s, even in the 1970s, Japanese people, Japanese consumer in 1960s and 1970s want to be American in 1950s. To go when they went to the Hawaiian Center. This is a kind of the cultural consumption logic. So the important thing is those kinds of the history is the local history, but the energy changed from coal to oil, but they can't be the oil cities. But so the nuclear city or Hawaiian Center. But all these kinds of the local history was strongly related to the US-Japan relationship and American global hegemony. This is post-war Japan itself, I think.
Thank you. So if I'd like to take the last question, if any. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to follow back to Professor Sam. You're from Georgetown, and obviously you're very interested in public policy. You have students who have done great research, and I think that's a very pressing concern of people in the region in Asia and also in, I guess, the whole region regarding food contamination. So I'd like to ask Dr. Igawa, is there any focus in your research institute between US and Japan now or in the future to address the concern of contaminated food and polluted air? Because I would think that Japan has taken the leadership in Asia regarding nuclear power. And now with the situation where more people, more countries wanted to empower themselves with nuclear plants, I think Japan will continue to be in the leadership of helping and support in establishing all these new nuclear plants. And I would hope that there will be more advanced technique, ways to protect our people regarding waste management, air pollution, and food contamination. Would that be something that you be interested in and be part of the future agenda? I also want to tack on that when at the nuclear summit, would any of these topics be brought up and be on the agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And I'd like to say that our University of Tokyo, there are scientists, especially in the Faculty of Agriculture and Faculty of Science, who are very much focused on this question of food contamination and continue to do in-depth research.
Thank you for your comment. Important one.
Yes, thank you very much for important contribution. And with this, I'd like to conclude this first session of this USJI workshop. And thank you very much for your cooperation. And I'd like to thank the presenters and commenters for the great contribution. Thank you very much.